The throw back to McCutcheon, and that's it. After a decade of disappointment and heartbreak, the DC Breeze are flying to championship weekend.
Knoll with 8, squeezes it back to Selfridge with 4, Selfridge with 3, hammer into the ground, and Seattle has won the West. The Cascades have pulled off the shocking win over Salt Lake here in the division title game. Holzmeyer trying to run around, Burnett trying to create something. This is dangerous. Could it be a Callahan? No. Bloodworth brings it in with 5 seconds to go. And with one more completion, the Carolina Flyers have pulled off the upset. And it's devastation for the Hustle at home in the playoffs again.
I think all year we knew we'd come down here, didn't give our best showing, and we were so happy, took care of business, got one more shot to come down and prove who we are, and that the division runs through us.
Ben, will Minnesota take the shot or will they just burn it?
I think they're going to burn the clock here. Berglund stops it there. Krennic and Larson go celebrate with him.
And Minnesota is going back to championship weekend.
Not to mention another Central Division championship as well for the Wind Chill.
Welcome back. It's Swing Pass. I'm Adam Ruffner. That's Cameron Brock. And we are down to the final 4 teams of the 2024 UFA season after another thrilling divisional championship weekend in the league. Carolina, DC, Minnesota, and Seattle all punching their tickets to championship weekend coming up on August 23rd and 24th in Salt Lake City, Utah. There were dramatic finishes throughout all 4 games, but most notably, Seattle taking away a semifinals bid from the potential host team in Salt Lake in a thrilling West Division finale. DC secures their first ever franchise appearance in the Final Four. Rowan, the former league MVP, getting his first trip to championship weekend. And first-year coach Lauren Boyle getting an absolute feather in her cap after a terrific season, summiting the toughest division in the entire association. Elsewhere, Carolina proving that their playoff experience just being too much for a snake-bitten and star-crossed Atlanta team that can't seem to get out from underneath of the shadows within their own home confines in the South Division finale. The Flyers now moving on to their 4th championship weekend appearance in franchise history. And in the Central Division, Minnesota securing their 2nd straight divisional title with the biggest win of the weekend over their Bordeaux rivals from Madison. Cam, there's not any shortage on, I think, things to talk about in this episode as far as the games themselves. But what are you kind of putting in your mind's eye heading into these final 3 games of the entire 2024 schedule?
Go Scades. Let's go. It's really exciting for me because it would be awesome for Salt Lake to be there, right? They're the host city. I'm sure they would have an amazing crowd out at that game. And the Shredheads would be going crazy in the semifinals. They actually would have had a rematch with Minnesota. Like, all of that would have been awesome. But man, I am so excited for Seattle. Even like Carolina, even though they're like a traditional kind of powerhouse in this league, they very much felt like the underdog in their game against Atlanta. Especially after the way the first quarter went, it kind of felt like here we go again, that we were going to see the same result we'd seen the previous 2 games in Atlanta. And, you know, the Boston DC game, you knew it was going to be maybe a little lower scoring. You knew it probably was never going to get too far out of reach for either side based on the styles they play. All 3 of those games really just kind of lived up to the hype. You know, we had this. It seems like every once in a while there's like one division where things kind of get a little out of hand. Although, as Evan Lepler pointed out in the Tuesday toss, Recently, that hasn't been the case necessarily, but yeah, we had 3 really kind of thrilling games. There was even some moments of tension in that Minnesota-Madison game where Madison at one point scored 4 goals in a row and kind of took control of the game. And you almost thought, like, are they going to creep back in and do it? Until Minnesota really grabbed a hold of it. So I just had a lot of fun watching Frisbee this weekend. It was really intense all across the board. And it just makes me that much more excited for championship weekend. And my personal favorite day of watching Frisbee of the year is semifinal Friday. Like, I love those 2 games where you've got, the top teams or the teams representing their divisions going head to head. You get back-to-back games. So you don't have to worry about overlap with like the timing. And that's my favorite Frisbee to watch all year because you're getting high quality teams. And, usually there's a lot to talk about from those games.
I totally agree with you on semifinal Friday. It also reminds me of the Mark Lloyd rule. A couple of seasons ago, Mark Lloyd, former great in this entire association, told me that he has this idea that if there's ever one of the semifinals that is kind of lacking, the other one is going to be an all-timer. Last year had that happen with the first semifinal between New York and Austin kind of being a little bit lackluster. And then the second one, of course, ending with the Joel Clutton tip into overtime, and then Salt Lake coming out victorious in spite of the fantastic Minnesota home crowd. But to your point about what Evan Lepler brought up in his Tuesday Toss piece earlier today, we're recording now on Tuesday night, he mentioned that in 24 of the last 28 divisional title games, that's over 85% of them, have been decided by 5 goals or fewer, which really speaks to the kind of contention and sort of rivalries at the top of each of these divisions. And in this past weekend, 3 of the 4 games were decided by 2 or fewer goals. I think, the DC Boston game obviously had a little bit of a breeze edge to it, the entire tilt, but to your point a second ago, Boston never really allowed for much breathing room from the home team. And it felt like they were the most impressive of any of the losers as far as just sticking through it all 4 quarters. But 2 of the 4 games came down right to the final possession. I mean, I don't know what more you can ask from that. I know we're going to get into kind of rule talk later in this episode with how the Carolina-Atlanta game ended, and we'll probably even start there as far as game analysis. But to sum up my point, like, this is another divisional championship weekend where it's just sort of, I think, a little bit eclipsed whatever expectations we had going into it, where we knew these were going to be contentious battles. We knew, especially in the season, we couldn't really anticipate what was going to happen in any given matchup. And yet it still had a way of sort of contorting the drama to make it all the more interesting. Like, I to your point, I had so much fun watching this Frisbee this weekend. Like, there is just an amount of excitement. And again, I know the Carolina Atlanta game had the clock bleed stuff at the end, which had people feeling a way about how rules should be formatted. But to me, that was like an ultimate tactical wet dream of just 2 coaches kind of battling out with lineups on a chessboard where they understood each other so well. It's the 5th matchup of the season, and one just found the slightest edge in order to get the W. And again, maybe that's just how we launch into this South Division championship game between Carolina and Atlanta, with the Flyers persevering 17-16 by completing the final 53 passes of the game as they bleed away over 4 minutes of game clock and sustain possession throughout the entirety of the final minutes of regulation. That's the final note of the game. There was a lot of other junctures in this, but where I wanted to start was the absolute elite level of just Frisbee that we saw in this rivalry matchup. I mean, both teams committed 10 total turnovers. Hats off to the Flyers and the Hustle. I mean, you really couldn't ask much more for a kind of tightrope drama between 2 of the league's elites.
Yeah, and the thing about that too, when you only have a game with 20 total turnovers and the turnover battle is literally even, it just adds so much drama to every single point of the game. Like every point feels like it could be the point that swings it for either team because both teams are playing so cleanly. I mean, we saw a first quarter and a half from Atlanta where they didn't have a single turnover. And it looked like they might just pitch a perfect game on offense. And, you would expect at some point a turnover is going to happen. We've never had a team finish a game with less than 4. So, you would think at some point something happens. But just as, quickly as I'm sitting there thinking Atlanta looks unbeatable, halfway through the second quarter, they looked very beatable. And it added... And that was a level of drama that I was like, I think all of us watching probably kind of had in the back of our minds, like, okay, Atlanta looks amazing right now, but we know what happened last year. We know what happened in 2021. We know how some years even they haven't made the playoffs because they've kind of lost some games maybe they shouldn't down the stretch of the regular season. And then it all happened at once. It's like the Jenga tower that looked as stable as it could possibly be with just the removal of that one critical piece toppled the whole thing.
So I feel like after watching the game now 2+ ish times, I figured out the moment that occurred in, and that was late in the second quarter. Atlanta is up 10-8, and there's just this really long point of attrition where Atlanta has a timeout to keep their D-line out there, and then Carolina actually switches their offense to defense in order to try to stymie a break attempt from Atlanta to possibly push their lead back to 3. And instead of the hustle, increasing their lead, they sort of deplete their D-line, turn it over, and then Carolina's offense is now on the field, their D-line offense is on the field, and they're able to ratchet back within a point. And it just felt like throughout that whole tumult, Atlanta re-incurred the kind of PTSD that has been afflicting them the past few playoffs that they've appeared in, where there's just this body language that comes out in a specific point where any minute error gets magnified. Again, there were 20 total turnovers in this game. This was the most clean game of Ultimate the entire weekend, one of the cleanest games the entire season between two teams. And yet, the hustle were visibly shrugging their shoulders, becoming deflated after any little mistake. And on the flip side, you have this Carolina team that reminded me entirely how they approached their 2021 title game in which they won, which was starting off their very first point of the game with a turnover, laughing about it on the sideline, and then going on to have the most pristine championship game performance in this association's history. Like, that was the exact same mentality that I saw last Friday night from the Flyers, where they didn't make many mistakes, but any ones they did, they shrugged off immediately. And on the flip side, you've got this Atlanta team that's just beating themselves up despite playing a game that Carolina veteran Ben Snell said that they started off, to your point, playing like they felt like they weren't going to commit a turnover the entire match.
Yeah. I mean, I would be curious, like, I don't know how we would find this. Like, what's the longest a team has gone into a game without committing a turnover? A quarter and a half has to be pretty dang close, if not the record. And to do it against a team the caliber of Carolina, too. I mean, this isn't like going and doing it against Detroit, right? Like, this is doing it against one of the best teams in the league. Extremely impressive. And, I hear you on where you felt the inflection point was, but to me, the inflection point was the very first turnover, because it wasn't just that it was a turnover and like, oh my gosh, perfection is broken. It was the reaction afterwards. Austin Taylor complaining about a call that, I don't know what call he wanted. There was no call to be made. The timeout is called by Carolina to put their offense on the field. And Austin Taylor comes, I didn't even know until you pointed out to me. I must have looked somewhere else. He seems to be screaming and very angry at Aiden Downey for a reason that we don't know or can't figure out. And Brett Holzmeier has to like usher him away. And like, this happened after a single turnover. And to me, like Austin Taylor, he's a fiery guy. Like, so for him to be fired up is not like out of the ordinary. But the fact that he is like verbally attacking his teammate after a single turnover, and I don't know what he was attacking him about. Obviously, it wasn't a turnover because it was thrown. The disc was thrown by Jeremy Langdon, and Austin Taylor dropped it. So like it goes on him for the turnover. But if that's the reaction after a single turnover, like it kind of felt like in that moment, like, oh my gosh, like if that's what's going to happen after the first mistake of the game, what's going to happen when the next one happens? And Austin Taylor had the second turnover. I mean, he got the disc and was a little too casual with a throw. It goes too high and it gets D'd. It's just like, it felt for me like that. And that was the same point, actually, because Atlanta calls timeout, puts their offense back on that same point. And it just kind of felt like everything started falling apart then. Like, it's like once perfection was broken, it was like they were in a glass house. And once the first window pane broke, everything shattered around it. And they just kind of never looked the same after that. Even when they scored, it looked so much more laborious. It looked so much more like there was so much more tension within the team, and it was like visible from the stream. Like the only person who I think, and you could tell me if you agree with this, who I felt like kind of kept their composure and kind of kept going on as business as usual for the rest of the game was Jeremy Langdon. And I felt like everyone else around him kind of shrunk throughout different points in the rest of the game. Not necessarily the whole time, but you could point to, I think everyone else on that line as either kind of disappearing or just falling into making simple execution errors or not running through a disc or you name it. And it was like, it happened.
I mean, I think mistakes are going to come up. And again, there were only 10 total for Atlanta, so I don't want to magnify any one of them. So I think to say like Langdon was the only person sort of gutting it out there might be a little bit much. Like I would say that Bobby Lay and Brett Halsmeyer still had fantastic games. I mean, you look at Halsmeyer, he led the game by over 200 yards in production. He had 819 total yards, 5 scores, 2 throwaways, but he would, other than sort of what you alluded to a second
throwaways.
ago,
Let's give him one throwaway. I know the stats say 2.
One of those throwaways was definitely not Halsmeyer's fault, but just to the point of like the man had 560 receiving yards. He was out there doing work. Bobby Lay had 2 of the most impressive plays all night. One of them being a complete full extension horizontal layout to a back corner, just dime ball, fade route basically to the opposite side of the field. Like a kind of one play for a player like Bobby Lay, who, by the way, shout out, is reportedly retiring after this season and is one of the league's greats as far as throwing. I believe finishes within the top 8, top 7. I'd have to go check real quick in all-time assists, in completions, one of the league's all-time great throwers. So hats off to Bobby Lay. He had a great performance. I think, again, it just kind of gets back to, does Atlanta have too high of an expectation for themselves? Because you just, again, like I look at these team stats and you look at the efficiency numbers and basically everything across the board exceeds Carolina. Like they were technically more efficient on breaks, technically more efficient in the red zone, technically more efficient on hooks. And yet, when you watch the game, Carolina has done such a good job of smelting down this deep attack that they've built up all season. We've talked about it numerous times on the show that they have one of the most impressive hucking games in the entire league in 2024. In this game, they take 4 huck attempts. They complete 3 of them. And other than that, they're just pounding the rock inside of the red zone. They're using Elijah Long. They're converting Anders Jungs and Alan Laviolette into these kind of quick churn cog pieces in this flow stack situation that they like to run. Mm-hmm. They're down some of their biggest throwers. They were without Alexander Wilcox, who is kind of their deep thrower from the backfield alongside Elijah Long. They didn't have Solyanik or team captain Trevor Lynch available in this game. And yet that was their best game of the year. They lose their last 2 matchups against Atlanta coming into this game. They have that 12-goal loss against DC just over a month ago at this point. Carolina looked kind of weird in the back half of the season after starting undefeated. Yet they go on the road in this game. They play their second sharpest, I should say, coming off their first round playoff performance against Austin, their second sharpest performance of the season, but now have 17 total turnovers in the playoffs, the most experienced core in the entire slate of Final Four contenders. They've got over a dozen players with starting level championship experience. And this was the game in which they announced that to everyone else. They said, hey, man, we're deep. We've got 4 or 5 starters on offense who won a title. We've got, Seth Weaver getting 3 blocks in this game, coming up super clutch when the team needs it. We've got rookie Christian Bielis flying around out there, heat-seeking missile whenever they need to play for him in the flat, especially. Just so much speed to go after it and hunt. And it's just, I don't know, man. Like, it was one of those games, we're talking with people coming into it, having watched the film, having kind of scouted both teams, like there was so much of a favoritism towards Atlanta, and yet you come out the other side with this Flyers win and you go, yeah, that's that Carolina team, man. That's what they do. Like Andrews Youngs was saying it in the post-game interview. They won 3 of the last 4 South Division titles. This division goes through us. And they're right.
I don't want to belabor the point on Atlanta's kind of issues. And you're right. Like Brett Holzmeyer, like you look at the stats, like they're great. There wasn't obviously a lot of mistakes. 10 total turnovers is like, that's a great game. Like if you told Atlanta coming into the game, you're going to have 10 total turnovers, they would take that like 100% in a heartbeat, right? Like they would not be mad about that whatsoever. It's the type of turnovers, like it's like, I've coached a lot of sports. Like I've coached basketball, right? Like there's times where you have turnovers that you kind of understand. And like, you don't ever love a turnover, but you understand a little bit more when someone just kind of got like surprise double teamed and turned the ball over versus you just threw a lazy pass and it got picked off and like something like that. And I think that's more what it is. It's like someone not running through the disc. It's like the shot at the end of the game. Why are we taking a blady shot that is way too short to Christian Olsen, like who is probably the 4th or 5th down on your line that you would want to throw kind of a 50-50 to, it's like things like that. It's like when the errors are more of like
the errors that they hadn't made all season, right? Like those weren't the mistakes that Atlanta was making when they were doing their turnovers earlier. It was because they were boosting it to Holzmeyer and it didn't quite work. Yeah, and it was,
it's the type of
field position turnover is a punt.
Yeah, these felt like I'm trying to do something I don't need to turnovers, or like I'm making, Brett throws out this beautiful huck and I'm going to go try to body somebody 15 yards away from where it's going to land instead of just running it and getting it. It's things like that. Now to Carolina, because they were great and like they found a way to rebound from like 2 games where Atlanta was very much in control, looked like the better team, and we had been kind of wondering, where is the Carolina team that played so great through the first 6 games? Where are they? Are they coming back? Are they gone? And they played really well against Austin and didn't have a lot of turnovers, but also weren't really able to stop Austin until late in the game and like kind of put them away. And that was what kind of worried me. It's like when you're playing as clean as they were in that game, but you're still not able to like create separation until like the end. That's where I was kind of worried. It's like, okay, offensively, you're playing so clean. Defensively, can you do something? Well, this is a game. One thing that's like incredible in this game is not only were there only 20 turnovers, but 15 of those turnovers were blocks. Like it wasn't just like people were throwing the disc into the ground or anything like that. Like this is like, in a lot of cases, the blocks were generated. Like it wasn't just something the offense did incorrectly.
There were terrific defensive performances throughout this game.
I think on both sides, like, Frankie Fernandez apparently had his wisdom teeth out on Tuesday, like an emergency wisdom tooth surgery, then comes out and gets 3 blocks. You already mentioned Seth Weaver and Bielis.
How about the clutchest block that will now be erased from our collective memories in what Jakeem Polk got in the final point of the game? I mean, and maybe this is how we kind of segue into, and I'm going to put like a virtual egg timer on in the background because we will just get lost on this subject otherwise about the final point and rules discussion and everything else. So, but anyways.
Yeah,
that final point block by Jakeem Polk. Carolina up 17-16, 4:30 left on the clock, 5 minutes left on the clock, gets the pull. It's the final possession of the game, turns out. They get maybe 5 passes into their drive, and then Jakeem Polk just blows up and under.
Yeah.
As Evan Lepler on the broadcast is saying, in these Carolina-Atlanta matchups, there's always something that twists at the end, and oh, there it is right there. And I mean, literal, just kind of the dude in the moment making the play. Hustle, get it. They get the disc back. They have a chance to tie. And then what you were just referring to a few moments ago, they try a crossfield pass. Christian Bielis gets a great read on it, has position, a lot of contact and physicality on the play, but it actually felt like the Atlanta receiver and Olsen kind of initiated a lot of that
Yeah,
from the
100%.
backside, given how Bielis had a complete inside lane to it.
Mm-hmm.
So then there's I believe technically there's like 4:02 left on the clock when Carolina takes over. And then they complete 53 straight passes. They literally march it all the way upfield from their own goal line into the red zone about 5 yards outside of scoring, and then march it all the way in the reverse direction back down the field to expend the entirety of the last 4 minutes of game clock. There's been a ton of chatter online since about should there be a backcourt violation? Should there be a shot clock? Should there be some sort of firing wall for teams that take this kind of conservative approach to the game? Is it anti-spirit and anti-competitive to initiate that kind of tactical element into the end of a game scenario?
No.
I guess I don't want to be the first one to take a nibble at this, given that I don't play in this league. So I'll let you take the first shot. I felt like I actually think it's one of the smartest things I've ever seen this league's history. I think that Carolina realized its true competitive edge in this matchup. You heard it from Ben Snell in the Tuesday toss as he was saying to Evan Lepler. We knew that we had Atlanta's offense on the ropes as far as their fatigue at the end of this really hot game in Atlanta. And we knew we could run them up and down the field without necessarily turning the disc over. And they took that and they took it to a W. And there's been this reaction that there's been some kind of lack of sportsmanship, lack of almost like dignity to the game in what Carolina did. And I just don't see it, man. Like, that was one of the most thrilling end of sequences I've ever seen between two rivals in this entire association's history.
I am going to completely throw out the entertainment part of it, because you're going to have, like, in terms of, for my argument here, because what's entertaining to one person isn't necessarily entertaining to another. It's a fool's errand to try to say, like, for me to try to convince people it was entertaining, right?
And I'm
not going to.
Don't take my word for it. I'm totally acknowledging my bias too. Like, I love the grinded out possession at the end of the game. Like, don't listen to me.
So here's the thing, Frisbee community. Be a little bit more imaginative. Be a little bit more willing to, like, think about, instead of just saying, well, Carolina couldn't do anything. Why couldn't Carolina do anything? Have you actually sat down and thought about what Carolina could have done? Because I can tell you what, I have, and I've come up with numerous answers for, like, what they could have done. Here's the thing. I'm going to guarantee right now, and if there is a UFA player out there who can tell me I'm wrong here, do it. But I'm going to guess I'm right. I don't think any team in this league has probably ever at any point practiced this situation. And the situation is the other team has the disc in the middle of the field, like, not on the sideline, like you didn't roll or pull it, but the other team has the disc, you're down one, and you need to get it back. I don't think teams practice this. I'd bet pretty heavily on this. And even if they do practice it, which, again, I don't think anyone does, they haven't practiced it with any sort of tactics. Like, what do you do? You know, you and I were talking the pre-show about, like, think about other sports. Well, what do you do in basketball when you need to get there? Now, obviously, there's a shot clock in basketball, but if you need to score a lot of points really quickly, you can't just rely on them running down the shot clock over again. You press, right? You double team, you press, you try to apply pressure with more bodies than they have in certain places of the basketball court. What do you do in football? You might send, like, jailbreak blitzes. Like, we really need to sack the
cover too.
Yeah. Like, what could have Atlanta have done? I'll give you at least 2 things they could have done. Number one, and this is something you and I talked about, you need to go play 6-on-5 close to the disc, basically. You need to send Brett Holzmeyer sitting underneath the deepest person, not behind them, like a little bit underneath the deepest person, or somebody back there where if they throw something down the field, like Brett's big and can potentially go get it, right? Disc might hang, especially on a hot, humid day. Disc is going to hang a little bit more. And you need to go play 6-on-5 on everyone else. That way you always have a double team available, but also like everyone's guarded. What else can you do if that doesn't work? That certainly applies more pressure. You could even amplify that. Like most of the time, the other team's going to have people like down the field a little bit more. Maybe you even go to the point where you go 6-on-4 and have like a big, one person essentially responsible for 3 people, but at least then you're forcing them to go forward. Like they can't just keep going backwards. The other thing you can do is literally get behind people. Like when you're on the mark, instead of being in front of them, be behind them. Like say, okay, I'm going to give you whatever throw you want upfield, but you are not throwing it backwards, right? You could even do a double team on the mark where you kind of Pac-Man it, is what we call it here in Indy, where you kind of make this shape and you make that shape behind them. So like they literally just like don't really have an angle to throw it backwards, because the worst case scenario there is they score, you get the disc back. But now if you score, and Ben Snell said this in the Tuesday toss, if you get the disc back on offense and then you score, you can create a high pressure throwing situation by doing a roller pull and double teaming on the sideline, right? And that creates a higher pressure situation where you can maybe force a turnover. But when you saw, like, what did Atlanta do? They tried to play basically just normal defense, and they were like poaching in the lane but leaving the resets open. Dude, and this was after they realized that, like, hey, Carolina's just bleeding the clock. We're talking about with like 2 minutes left after they'd already been bleeding for 2 minutes and had gone forward, gone backwards. They're still like poaching in the lanes and leaving the reset open occasionally. And it's just like, you can't do that. Like, you are literally playing into their hands. And I get that there was fatigue involved in that decision making. And again, this is not a situation that teams practice. I guarantee Atlanta's never practiced this. And I guarantee no other team has. I would be very shocked to find out that I'm wrong here. But you have to start creating situations where they have to move forward, or where you just outnumber them so much in the backfield that their best option is a deeper throw upfield, which is more likely to cause a turnover than just a dishy little like 5-yard dump pass, right? Where you can kind of throw it out into whatever space you want to. So for all of you out there who are just like, well, we got to make a rule about this because Atlanta couldn't get the disc back. Atlanta had options. They might not have talked about those options. They might not know them previous to maybe listening to this podcast. I am not the smartest man in Frisbee. I feel like I know a lot and I have a lot of experience, but I'm sure there are smarter people out there who could have figured this out. We have to think about what can a team do to counteract what Carolina was doing. And Atlanta didn't do anything to counteract it. They kind of just tried to play normal defense, which is not something you can do in a keep away situation.
Well, and on the flip side of that, and what became so impressive for my Frisbee-rotted nerd brain that has just watched too much of this league, is that I've never seen a team take advantage of a rule set so greatly in a specific scenario without really like compromising it as Carolina did in this. You talk about the kind of strategic adjustments as far as trapping or sort of blitzing in the backfield or doing something to become more aggressive against your opponent. And on the flip side for Carolina, it was understanding that the sort of meta, and we've talked about this again numerous times on the show, has become pretty defensively minded. I mean, you look at teams like Seattle, who has now qualified for championship weekend, Madison, even Minnesota to a certain extent, is like, break trains are the way in which you really gain momentum. And so for Carolina to completely stymie Atlanta from that opportunity, from not only getting a tie, but then being able to sort of run downhill, have a sort of strategic defensive element that they could then run against the Flyers offense, to completely short circuit that, I think is one of the most savvy things I've seen again in this league's history. Like, it's just one of those things that makes you go, oh man, that's a real fun wrinkle. Like, I know it doesn't end in a layout block or a buzzer beater, which again, the same people that are detracting from this essentially dump reset rule would also be complaining about the 50-50 jump ball if it came down to that at the end of regulation too. So I don't even want to hear it from those people. Like, and again, to your point, it just can't be solved with a rule change. Like, I appreciate what people have brought up. I do think that there is a need for consideration about just tweaking or introducing different sorts of things to sort of make the sport more presentable, right? Like you in a completely ideal world, you don't want to be taking negative passes to end a game. I completely appreciate that. And yet at the same time, the second to last pass of this entire game between, again, the fifth meeting between two of the league's oldest rivals was almost Callahan.
Yeah.
It was almost Christian Olsen picking off the pass on a lazy reset to Ethan Bloodworth and tying it up for Atlanta. So, like, the notion that this wasn't, like, dramatic is just silly. It's silly.
Yeah.
But
I agree. And I think we just have to, it felt very much like a reaction to, I got a flat tire, I need a new bike. No, like, fix the tire.
No.
Like, find the more obvious solution, and here's the thing, I don't blame Atlanta for this whatsoever. I just said no team in the league practices this situation. Like, they don't. I'm telling you, they don't. So for them to not know what they should do is not a criticism of Atlanta. They're just the test subject in this area, because I guarantee any other team in that situation, the same thing would have happened. Unless your defensive style is just such that you're always in Indy, our O-line, when we turn the disc over, we call it chaos defense. We would literally like plan sometimes on defense to just like overload the backfield, double team, and basically we leave one person essentially unguarded and just try to like force chaos in the backfield. But that's like not something that we're planning at the end of the game in the situation. It's just like something we do occasionally. But that's kind of like, I feel like that chaos defense is what you kind of need to do in this situation. You need to leave someone upfield just like completely open and just try to create as much chaos close to the disc as possible. But again, Atlanta, like, this is not a criticism of them. Like, Carolina had the strategy, they executed it, and I feel like now this becomes much like people having to adjust to how to field polls when the polling rules changed. You see a need arise and you react to it. I feel like teams across the league now might think about, okay, if we're in a situation, a team's holding disc against us, what can we do to like at least force them to score, if not straight up get a turnover? Like, we need to force them to not have the disc in their hands anymore. So this might be the case study for that moving forward.
If we're down 1 with 1 minute to go and we don't have possession and we can't call a timeout, what do we do in that situation? Because that is something that you have to game plan for. I feel like every other situation in amateur divisions is, we'll just play hard defense and earn the break. Okay. Well, Carolina just ran that out of existence. They just did a jiu-jitsu chokehold to the team that we all pretty much agreed consensusly was the most balanced and championship-oriented franchise heading into the final, 7 games of this entire season. Like, again, just hats off to Carolina. And one more point, like, people are challenging me, it's not thrilling. I would call it pretty thrilling that this game came down to essentially just like one team realizing about a minute into the clock burn that they were just going to get choked out on the mat and not being able to do anything about it. Like that, I've never quite seen this sort of, again, suplex maneuver that the Flyers administered to the Hustle at the end of this game in a game of that caliber, where they just said, you're not getting another opportunity, and we're not even letting you get other players on the field unless there was the Bobby Lay end of game, fatigue injury and cramping issue that subbed on Justin Burnett and allowed one last heat seeker missile at the end of that game. But we spent a bunch of time on the South Division Championship. We've got to move on to the other 3 divisional matchups. I think most notably, DC finally, redemptively, pulling out their first East Division title 16-14 over a very hard fighting Boston Glory team. Rowan finally making it to championship weekend after his illustrious career, and all of the rest of that DC team that I feel like everyone has been very pronouncedly stipulating as being one of the true elites in this league, and yet just not being able to get over the hurdle of the Empire, but Boston defeating them in the first round, and now DC defeating Boston, gets Breeze into their first championship weekend bracket. They now feel like the ostensible favorites. I don't think there's any team remaining that has a more impressive resume than what the Breeze have built, specifically with how they've done it. Multiple goal victories now over 3 of the best franchises in the entire association. In this game and in their last 6, they just get a slew of breaks. We talk so much about the passing proficiency of this DC team. They're about to set a league record for highest team completion rate in a single season in UFA history. And yet, what this team has become elite at is defensive pressure, particularly in the backfield. In their last 6 games, they're averaging 9.1 break scores per game. And you just saw that kind of from the opening volley in this game against Boston, where there's just Jasper Tom defensive pressure in the backfield, David Bloodgood playing out of his mind once again in a playoff game, and just top down this kind of focus and discipline of understanding Boston isn't going to give us a ton of chances, but we can generate them. And when we do, we're going to run downhill at them. And this Breeze team, and this is a total credit to first-year coach again, Lauren Boyle, is just their lineups, the way they approach every game, the way that they can balance the amount of talent that they have across both lines and get everyone ample touches. It's just such a credit to all of the coaching and players to really optimizing what is otherwise a pretty hard thing to, I think, calibrate. Like having that many different players who are high touch, in rhythm sort of throwers, and then getting defensive pressure when you have a pretty objective height imbalance against the Glory offense. Like this DC team is just, they're formidable.
They, coming into this weekend, I think it felt pretty unanimous that people thought the 2 best teams remaining in the playoffs were DC and Atlanta. The way they've been playing the back half of the season, both of those teams. And even though Atlanta is kind of like the team that's kind of still like at the top of the power rankings, it really felt like DC was the team who had really been the most impressive down the stretch. And in this game, it was no different. We just talked about that game where Carolina and Atlanta only had 10 turnovers apiece. DC only had 11, so just about as clean. I think playing against a better defensive team in Boston, though, like this 11 turnovers is actually maybe even more impressive to me. What continues to just be an unheralded story for me. Like we mention him on occasion, but I don't know we ever give him all the flowers he really deserves, is just Andrew Roy just being the best center pivot handler that this league has seen. And I don't think that's even up for debate at this point. Like, I think if you need a guy to just be the steady hand that runs an offense and that you can trust to make every right decision from, the time the pull is received until the time you're in the end zone, I don't think we've had a player be able to do it as well as him. And the scary thing being that, like, he may not even be really at his prime yet. Like, he's still young, but he feels like he has like an old man game already. Like, he has such an understanding of where the disc needs to go and what he needs to do to get it there. And I don't know if there's any person in the league that looks as relaxed with the disc in his hands as A-Roy. Like, it's just kind of uncanny to me. Like, handlers in general look relaxed when they have the disc. They're used to having it a lot. But like with A-Roy, it looks like within the few seconds he has it, he has diagnosed every possibility that the defense can throw at him and exactly where the disc needs to go. And then he just executes it at near levels of perfection. And, in this game, most completions in the game, 41, 100% completion percentage. Like, this is like such a ho-hum game for him that feels like this is the average. Like, this is just what he does game in and game out. And I don't know if we really give him enough flowers because, the stats aren't going to be eye-popping. He's usually not making the flashy plays, but he just makes every right play throughout the entire game. And he's a little bit undersold as how well he's even played defense on a turn, as we were talking about in the pre-show. He really does everything very well. And as far as with the disc in his hands, maybe the best pivot handler we've seen.
I don't want to take anything away from what you're saying because I completely agree with all of it. But I also want to just kind of expand on it and say that, you look at the sort of player stats from this game. I mean, the top 5 throwers for DC had 1 combined throwaway.
Yeah.
All completed 23 plus passes. 4 of the 5 were perfect on the evening against Boston. That to me speaks as much to A-Roy's talent to the system and the approach and the way in which everyone is slotted in so niche specifically to what they need to do on the field. And A-Roy, to his credit, exceeds phenomenally in his role, but he is also completely within his wheelhouse wherever he is on the field because he doesn't have to do anything outside of what is absolutely within his strengths. Yeah. And I just feel like you can say that about any number of the offensive starters and even defensive players for this DC team. It feels like of any team this season, they have scouted better than anyone else in the association. I mean, Rowan McDonald, you talked about this on Twitter. Mm-hmm. One of the knocks that we've had, and even my reticence about voting him as one of the top players coming into the season, was some of the struggles that he'd have specifically over the last few years in the professional level of turnovers. There's no doubt about his talent and his impact on the game, but particularly in these playoff matchups, and particularly against New York in the past, he's had 3-4 throwaways in games. Against Boston, 34-34, 2 assists, 247 total yards, just absolutely flourishing. And just to your point, looking absolutely unflappable in that position. And to me, all of that summates into, again, Lauren Boyle, I'm forgetting his first name, Drew, the defensive coach, Xavier Maxted, the way in which this semi-new coaching staff has taken over the principles of the departed Daryl Stanley and just sort of improved all of them, just sort of taken every dial and turned it up a couple of notches. It's like they've had this talent now for a few seasons and everything just seems to be at optimal levels.
Yeah, they, Jasper Tom,
the defensive pressure in the backfield is unmatched right now. I mean, Bloodgood and Tom are just heat seekers back there.
The plays I think it was the first break opportunity for DC, right? The play he made where he just read the play so well and reacted and just was able to get the D. I was just like, he was a guy who wasn't available all season, but he's just such a difference maker for them. David Bloodgood, 3 blocks in this game, played great. The thing is,
Bergeron getting a sky block on Babbitt later in the first half.
They only converted on half of their break opportunities, which is well below where they've been converting recently. But they had over twice as many break opportunities as Boston did. I mean, Boston only generated 4 opportunities throughout the game, and that's just not going to get it done against a team that's going to be as efficient with the disc as DC is. And it kind of felt like just like the magic just ran out a little bit for Boston. And I remember watching, the game was evenly scored quarters 2 through 4. I mean, it was just the first quarter where there was a point differential, but it just kind of felt like at one point DC was up 3, halfway through the third. And just with the slow pace that both of these teams play with, I was like, that's the game. Like, I just don't know how Boston makes up a 3-goal deficit in this particular matchup, even though there was like 16 minutes, 17 minutes left on the clock. It felt kind of insurmountable because you knew it wasn't going to be a super high scoring game with these two because they're both so good defensively. They don't mind taking long possessions offensively. And, Boston, the struggles on offense that I think I've been a little wary of, though they only had 14 turnovers. It wasn't like they had an astronomical amount, but the struggles they've had, sometimes moving the disc offensively, reared their head, is particularly in the backfield, which is, I feel like, where so much of the issues have been. And DC is probably about as good, if not the best in the league at pressuring in the backfield. So like it was kind of like DC's strength on kind of where I think Boston's weakness is. So DC really took advantage there, and like I feel like that's really where they got their lead. And credit to Boston, they had some plays in this game too, like some phenomenal defensive plays, and Jeff Babbitt was still doing some Jeff Babbitt things occasionally. I feel like the stats are wrong. I feel like I remember him getting 2 kind of end of quarter situation Ds. I might be wrong on that, but to your point, like when you have your top 5 throwers on offense, like DC did, with 1 total turnover, it's just like, it kind of feels like you're sort of helpless playing defense against that. I was so happy for Rowan, and I loved the quote from him where he said, like, I've coached some of these guys, now they're my teammates, and I'm older, I'm slower, and now I just kind of I don't remember his exact words, but essentially him saying, I kind of just get to enjoy them being the ones carrying most of the weight, and I'm just kind of along for the ride, and just kind of doing my little part, and that, Rowan hasn't had great playoff performances in the past, but what he has been for this team in many seasons is like the guy who kind of had to do everything for them and was putting up just astronomical numbers. And I can relate to this to some extent, where when you look at my best statistical seasons, they don't always follow with a ton of team success, because I think just in general, the best teams are going to have a lot of those stats kind of end up getting split amongst the team. It's not all going to be about one guy. Like, how many teams, like, outside of the very early years where maybe you would say, well, you have Bo Kittredge you win, like in the last like 8-9 seasons, how many teams where you're like, well, they have this one player and that's what's going to win them the game? Like, it's always been like a collection of talent, like a group of 3 or 4 guys maybe that you talk about. And I think like that's where we're at with this DC team right now, where there's just, you can point to so many different players that have such big hands in their victories that it can just be spread out a little bit more. You don't have to rely on just Rowan to go out there and play his best game for you to have a chance.
So a couple of final notes building off of what you were just talking about. The strength of DC versus Boston's weakness, I think, is a really apt point about DC's handler pressure being probably the best in the league, with Jasper Tom and David Bloodgood leading that attack. And then Boston having a sort of hamstrung ability in some of their offensive sets to get a little grounded in that space, really yielding to those first half turnovers that facilitated so many of the early breaks that allowed DC to get that edge and that lead to just be able to rely on the offense that executes at the second highest success rate and has the highest team completion rate in the entire league. And then you mentioned what Rowan said at the end of the game. I wanted to actually get it specific because he really nails it. Quote, "It's just unbelievable how much sacrifice that went into this from the top down. The next generation won us this game. AJ Merriman steps up. Jacques Nissen steps up. These players that I used to coach, now as I get older and slower, they're taking these huge roles and they're pushing us forward. I don't have to do anything anymore, and it's so lovely." Like,
that part's the best. It's so lovely.
and like you can just hear it from him. I mean, it's one of those things where like I've watched a lot of these players. It's weird kind of watching the Indianapolis players that are now retiring, that group people are younger than I am. So to see people fading out of their playing careers as I'm still grinding away here in the back end is a little weird. And one of the things that I really appreciate, though, from my vantage point is a player like Rowan, who I think in a way got pushed into a playmaking capacity that, while his athleticism that he trained his ass off for so many years to get and is so deserved of, was sort of an accelerated notion of where he is at as an actual mental leader. I think this is always the role that he's been most enabled for, is this sort of old guard, having seen it, but can still get to that level, can still kind of hop up. He's gotten back his verticality and his burst over the past season and a half, and he can still show it. He still has 1,000 throws. He can still release it at every angle, but like, he doesn't want to be the dude doing what he did back in 2019, 2018 when he won the league MVP, where he's out there making every play, doing everything, breakneck pace, up tempo, having to lead this team by just, being bloodthirsty out there. I don't know if that's his speed, man. Like, obviously he's capable of it. Like, obviously his accomplishments in the sport have shown he can do that sort of thing. But like, seeing him in this sort of elder lion role where he is just so excited about everyone else coming up underneath of him, I don't know, man. It just feels like he's found his stride. And again, like, having seen that performance against Boston where he's just perfect from the field, it's like, yeah, just let everyone else take over. I love this.
I mean, it just takes so much of the pressure off too. Like, when Rick Gross joined the O-line and became like a real cutting threat for us, like, before that, I mean, it was really just me. I got all the attention. In kind of the similar way, like, Rowan had all these players coming up around him that were so talented and really grinding to be better ultimate players that were able to pick up some of that slack so he didn't have to go at that breakneck pace. Like, I feel that. Like, I've gone through that same situation in Indy where all of a sudden the talent around me just started to increase, and like, it allowed everyone to be a little bit better because we weren't having to extend ourselves into places that maybe took away from where our true strengths lied. So, yeah, his stats take a hit, right? But like, who cares? The only stat that really, I think, anyone worth their salt in this league cares about is wins. And, they're heading to championship weekend, and I couldn't be happier for the DC Breeze, and like, especially for the guys who have been around for a while, like not just Rowan, but like Jeff Wodach, who's been a really good player for them for a long time, and at some points in his career has been just not just really good, but like an all league caliber player. And for those guys especially that have been around for a long time to finally like break through that wall, like, I remember in 2019 we broke through, like, Keenan Plew and I both crying, and like, the only hug Keenan Plew has ever given me in my entire life, I'm pretty sure, was in that moment. He's not a hugger, and keep in mind, this is 10 years into being teammates. The first hug we ever shared was in that moment. So like, I get it. Like, it's there is like a weight that gets pulled off of you, and also like just the sense of like all of it was worth it. Like, all of the hours you put in, all the losses you had to endure, all the little tweaks and minor injuries that you might have had to, gone through PT for, like, all the things you said no to so you could go play Frisbee. It feels worth it in that moment. And so just really happy for those guys, and really excited. Like, they go in not just with the, like, oh, hey, we finally made it to championship weekend, but they definitely go in, I think, as the favorite. I think anyone who doesn't have them
They're the favorite
is lying.
They're the overall number 1 seed, technically, too.
Yep.
Like, they come in as the technical host to the entire championship weekend event. Like, DC has a lot of momentum, and as much as it is kind of a coronation of, 8 straight playoff appearances worth of achievement, they know the job's not finished.
Yeah.
They have that Kobe post-game interview in their head, like, job's not finished. We're not done here. But we should move on. Let's talk about the West Division finale. I mean, that might have been not just might have been. That was the most unexpected result of the entire weekend. Seattle coming out 21-20 on top over Salt Lake. It felt like the Shred had all the home field advantage. They were the reigning West Division champions. They had been kind of on the come up. They had defeated Seattle in the final weekend of the regular season. I know that there was the Lucas Ambrose quote about, we felt like we didn't play well going into that, week 13 game against Salt Lake. I know that Seattle had the internal motivation, but going into this game, I felt like the Cascades were a pretty definitive underdog. And yet they come out with this absolutely historical win on the road against Salt Lake. It feels like the Cascades now are like the harbinger of bad playoff performances for a home team, given the 2016 semifinals game against Madison, having gotten to championship weekend by defeating a home team, San Francisco team at that point in order to get in, and now defeating the Shred with an opportunity to go into a host championship weekend event. Like, the Scades team is just ripping out hearts, Temple of Doom style around this league.
I actually had, I know I was in the minority. I thought Seattle was going to win this game. And you can go back and check my tweets if you don't believe me. I agreed with Ambrose's assessment that they just, they kind of came out flat in that game. The thing that really gave me, there was a few things that like really kind of made me think that Seattle was going to do it. Number one being that in the back half of that game, they outplayed Salt Lake in the back half of the regular season game. And it really felt like it was just like one of those games where they kind of let just like a slow start just really doom them and kind of put them in a situation where they probably just weren't going to be able to win. The second thing was that throughout this season, when they've been given a second chance, they've just taken advantage of it. Like they've seemed to make adjustments and like be better on the other end. So, they had the Colorado loss at the beginning of the season, which was a tight game, and were able to, they only ended up winning by a goal, but like they had a big lead in that game and kind of like, to me, showed that like they really probably were the better team in that matchup. While they did lose their second matchup against Oakland, they were down a couple very key pieces. Khalif El Salam, I remember, being one of them. And still, despite being down one of their most talented players, like they were just right there in that game the entire time. That was also around the time Oakland was like playing their best Frisbee of the season. And it just kind of felt like Seattle was still finding ways to weather that and like be competitive and be in that game. So I really thought that like coming into this, they had what it took to really create some problems for Salt Lake. And we saw it. And like, there was no more telling stat than this to me. Salt Lake, who, while not as good offensively this year as they were a year ago, like I think we would still consider one of the more top teams, especially when they have everyone available. And like Will Selfridge was obviously available in this game. Seattle out-converted them offensively by 19%, which is crazy. Like if you would have told me they would have outperformed them, I wouldn't have been super shocked. But to do it to that extent, to have Salt Lake have 19 total turnovers and 18, or I guess 17 technically. I think there was an end of quarter where they just didn't take a shot, so it technically counts as not converting. But for 17 of those turnovers to come from Salt Lake's offense, absolutely mind-boggling to me. And that's a credit to Seattle's defensive pressure, I think, but also like offensively. While Spencer Lofink has all the stats and like obviously played a fantastic game, I think he's the easy one to spot. Like he clearly played a fantastic game. He got a shout out in the honor roll. I think especially in the midway through the third, all the way to the end of the fourth quarter, Mark Munoz just continued to like get them unstuck. And when the offense wasn't really flowing, he continued to just complete every pass. And I thought his performance, while not statistically as impressive as Spencer Lofink's or some of the other players in the team, was so crucial down the stretch just for maintaining possession and continuing to keep that O-line conversion percentage high. And I was just so impressed by the maturity I felt like I saw from Seattle when that game got tight again late, and they were able to withstand and kind of calmly go down and score to take the lead, with only 35 seconds left.
Munoz was terrific. Lofink, I felt like, was the player of the game, just given his fluidity with the disc whenever they needed it. He dug out a possession late in the game in the red zone and then dished an assist to teenage sensation Leahy. And like, Seattle was just in rhythm the entire game. They didn't let anything sort of dispossess them from what they were trying to do offensively. Again, it wasn't the best success rate that they had on O-line the entire season, but given the opponent and given the stakes, it felt like their best offensive performance of the entire season. I mean, they were just able to generate whatever they wanted whenever they needed it. They weren't anywhere near perfect. Again, they were 14-23. They still squandered away 8 possessions on offense, or 9, excuse me. But to your point, like, Munoz was in rhythm the entire game. He was sort of the key for any unlocking of the field that they wanted. Lofink was able to punch everything in. Garrett Martin was a shark in the red zone, just hunting out goals and kind of getting open whenever they needed him to. And everything kind of flowed from that. I mean, Zeppelin Ronig was fired up on each of his goals. The Seattle team just kind of played to the absolute level that we've been sort of building towards this entire season, where they've shown bits and pieces of a complete game. They have this terrific defensive stat head, led by the league leader in blocks, Lucas Ambrose, but, they don't necessarily have a bulkhead of quality wins. And so there's a little bit of an asterisk there. On offense, they have all of this talent, but it hasn't necessarily proven itself in big games. And yet in their biggest game, they now outperform, to your point, the Shred by 19 percentage points on offense. Like, it just kind of all comes together for the Cascades in the biggest moment in almost a decade for this franchise. And it feels like, again, just a time to give flowers to both the coaching staff and the players for what they've been doing all season, which, to your point, having rocky points of any given contest, yet realizing what are the biggest moments. When is the possession that we need to convert this offensive hold? When is the sort of moment that our defense needs to seize on it and punch in this break? Like, the Cascades have proven, and why they're deserving of this West Division title, of being the best of those 7 teams in utilizing all that.
They really started early in this game, too. They forced some turnovers really early in this game. I mean, Salt Lake's honestly really lucky they didn't get blown out in this game the way their offense was performing, because
there was meat in the bone.
Here's the thing that, I think the Seattle team could do anything. I feel so good about their chances at championship weekend. I know
they're a dark horse.
I know people are going to say they're the underdogs and all this stuff. And yeah, but people have been saying that all season. Like, it clearly didn't stop them from going through and making it to championship weekend. But one thing that was interesting is their D-line, when they would force turns, it felt like the closer the game was, the worse their D-line played with the disc in their hands. It was almost like they played with way too much looseness. Their first 2 turnovers, they turned it back almost immediately, forcing throws that they didn't need to throw. One from Khalif El-Salam and one from Lucas Ambrose. So, I mean, you're talking about your top, 2 of, if not your 2 top players on your roster, and they're making kind of some just big almost like they felt the weight of the moment. We're like, yeah, I'm just going to throw a score right here. But they didn't need to. They had options. There were easier throws available to them. They probably would have scored within another 2 or 3 throws had they just worked the offense. But then when they went down by a few goals, that's when you saw their D-line kind of rein it in. And then when they got the disc, it seemed like they were much more concerned with being patient and punching it in. And you would love to see them do that earlier. Don't just do it when you feel like you're behind and it matters so much that you have to do everything you can to make sure you score this goal. You should have that mentality every single time as a D-line you get a turnover. It should always feel like you have to score this goal. So make as many throws, make the smart throws. Don't try to win and score with your throws. We talk about, this is something we talk about in Indy a lot. you don't win with your throws, win with your legs. Like, win by getting so open in such easy to throw to space that it's like almost impossible not to complete that pass, so that we can just keep completing easy passes instead of, I think I might be able to throw this 35-yard bender that might hit that guy for a score. No. Win with your legs. Don't try to win with your throws. And like, there were a couple of times throughout this game where they tried to win with their throws from their D line, and they resulted in turnovers every time. But when they were patient and just wanted to grind that Salt Lake O-line into the ground with some good, like, solid offense, they were able to. And if they can find a way to, like, switch that mentality and do that throughout an entire game, like, they can definitely beat anybody that play a championship weekend. I think they just need to get rid of, like, a little bit of, like, kind of that youthful exuberance and excitement and kind of almost, like, mellow out a little bit.
Well, I think one of the things that Seattle has demonstrated throughout the season is one of their strengths is adaptability. I mean, in the first 7 games, they were completing 7.7 hucks. In their last 7 starts of the season, they have 5.2 hucks per game. They've really reined in that kind of vertical attack and been a lot more choosy as to how they're going to engage downfield. And I feel like that's representative of, again, there's sort of total team discipline as they push deeper into this postseason of just understanding the stakes, understanding what is at play, and understanding what any given possession is going to yield for them. I think that they really have their finger on the pulse. I mean, you look at the ways in which some of the younger players are performing on this team, all the rookies. I mean, on defense, I think it starts with Jasper Dean. He's been a true revelation for them. Right now, I would put him on my first team all rookie ballot. I just think he's been such an important part of their counterattack. He's been able to get blocks both as a double team kind of on the mark as well as in space, given his size and his frame. And then you look on offense, Gavin Leahy, I was spacing on his first name earlier a few moments ago. He was instrumental on a couple of offensive possessions, particularly in the second half. He had that upline thread the needle throw to Zeppelin Ronig along the sideline. And then on the game-winning drive, he was the one that unlocked a double team trap on the sideline that then presented an opportunistic overrun on the goal line that gave the Garrett Martin go-ahead goal its opportunity. Like, Leahy showed an absolutely unflappable quality for being in that kind of late game pressure situation on the road in a completely adverse environment with that many fans, just absolutely executing and stepping through a double team. Like, that is a situation that I watched similar players just get absolutely flatlined in before. And yet he comes out with aces. And similarly, like, Cedar Hines gets a fantastic block on a sideline against Grant Lindsley, a Worlds team player, in the second half. Like, the Cascades' ability to not only have their star players performing in the ways that they need them to, but elevating the secondary and role players into positions where they can be their playmakers has been something that has carried them throughout this season, where it's just been like up and down the roster. Anyone who kind of gets into the action has just been a playmaker at times. I mean, I was talking to you about this in the pre-show, like Aaron Wolf, man.
Yeah.
I wish I had more opportunity to talk about what an addition he has been for this Seattle team. I mean, I know he's a German national player. I know he comes in with a whole bunch of talent. That's aside from the point. He's probably, and I say this with conviction, probably the most underrated offseason addition, and that's in an offseason that came with Ben Katz going to Boston with all sorts of movement throughout the entire association. Like, Aaron Wolf has been it for the Seattle team. He's been a top 7 O-line defensive player off of turns. He was absolutely executing in those short red zone situations alongside Spencer Lofink for the Cascades in Salt Lake. Like, he has just been a gamer in and out for the Scades team, in his rookie season.
On the flip side, we talked about, you mentioned the proficiency with which, like, the DC top 5 throwers, they had one combined turnover, right, in their game. You look at Salt Lake, their top 4 guys who had the disc in their hands combined for 8 turnovers. It really felt like the moment it just felt like a little too big for them. I don't know if it was the added pressure of potentially hosting. I'm sure that there was a little bit of added pressure in that sense.
Bryce Merrill mentioned as much,
Yeah.
the head coach in the Tuesday toss. He said that there had just been kind of this adding element in the background since it had been announced in February.
Yeah. And they had 4 players with multiple throwaways, and it's just you're just not going to win a game like that. Jordan Kerr didn't, he had a clean game, no throwaways, but also he only had 20 touches, which isn't an incredibly low number, but you would love for him to be getting the disc more, but he was, tasked with beating Lucas Ambrose around the field. And I really liked the point. I think it was Ian Toner made this point that, if it wasn't him, I apologize if I'm crediting the wrong person, but I think he made the point that Jordan Kerr needed to really sell that he was going to go deep. That sometimes teams have maybe teams have kind of figured out that he really doesn't want to go deep. So they kind of just sit underneath him because he won't finish the cut deep. And then he shortly after that goes deep, beats the Ambrose deep on a beautiful throw. I'm sorry, I don't remember who threw it, but beautiful throw, deep throw to him.
Jay Stunabile threaded that thing.
And it just hits him right in stride, and it kind of feels like, yes, this is what Jordan Kerr needs to do. He needs to be willing to go deep. Because here's the thing, at any given time, Jordan Kerr might be the fastest player on the field, and it kind of feels silly that he wouldn't just kind of take advantage of his size and speed more. But it just kind of seems like it never happened again, right? It was that one time, and we didn't see it again throughout the rest of the game. And while he had a clean game, this is one of those things. I think he needed to have a bigger impact for Salt Lake to have a chance, and they obviously still had a chance, but for them to look better offensively, and they just looked so disjointed from the get-go on offense, and they never really recovered. Even when they took the lead, they still weren't scoring with a lot of consistency throughout that time. It was, it's like I mentioned with Carolina earlier, they played their best Frisbee in the first half of the season, and then it looked like they kind of just never recovered and got back to the form that we saw at the beginning.
Well, and I think it comes down to, and the numbers that I keep reflecting on, is Salt Lake 19 turnovers, Seattle 7 blocks. So 12 unforced errors. And that was something that Salt Lake's head coach, Bryce Merrill, has been harping on for the past few weeks, is that the Shred, and particularly on offense, just have this hamstrung ability to sort of self-inflict wounds, where particularly I feel like in the reset space, and since Luke Jorgensen has not been available for the Shred offense, they have such a harder time pivoting from sideline to sideline. One of the things that the Shred offense was so successful at in their first 2+ seasons in this league was ratcheting across the width of the field and getting from right rail to left rail and allowing Jordan Kerr to just work his magic with whatever he was going to do in the red zone on that left rail. And since his injury and since Luke Jorgensen has not been available, the Shred offense just doesn't have that finishing move that was such a prevalent part of how they succeeded in this league. They didn't necessarily, I think, have the most balanced attack in reflection. I felt like, and we've talked about this before, that they kind of needed to overload Jordan Kerr in a certain sense of finishing around the rim and helping them kind of get the ball across the goal line. And without that ability, you can really see how they have just struggles in converting. They cannot kind of get past themselves at certain points.
Yeah, but there were just some really bad turnovers, right? You mentioned the reset space, and that's kind of the death of an offense when your turnovers in the reset space, because obviously you give the short, in many cases, a shorter field to work with, right? For the defense when they take possession. And, it's an unfortunate thing. It would have been an amazing atmosphere had they made it. I think like they're all obviously all going to be kicking themselves over the opportunity they had. Like you're hosting the game, you've beaten this team already. You have a chance to take it to championship weekend in front of your home crowd. But you're right. Like I think the Luke Jorgensen injury was a little too much for them to overcome in this particular game, given the amount of like pressure Seattle is able to like put on teams with like just what they finished the season with like 5 different guys with double digit blocks. Like, it's pretty, they're able to generate pressure at a level that like little to no other teams can.
Well, and again, hats off to Seattle. It's their first time in the playoffs in 8 seasons. They also retake a championship weekend bid in their second opportunity in the postseason in as many attempts. And it's just a huge kind of congratulatory moment to both the players and I feel like the coaching staff in Kelly Johnson and Jesse Bolton and just what this team has been building towards. I mean, I remember a few seasons ago, Jack Brown saying that this Cascades team was going to be building out of something different from what Seattle Ultimate had kind of been putting forward the last several seasons. He was really putting his foot down, all 10 toes, should say both feet down, about, this sort of youth movement. And I feel like Mark Munoz has been an absolute totem pole in that too, of just, they've been committed to this for a few seasons. It hasn't necessarily germinated in the ways that they've wanted to. This has been a team that has not finished above 500 since they last made the postseason. But they show this confidence level that has been cultivating for so many years. And I feel like it's finally come to fruition. Again, like Jack Brown sort of slotting over from a long-time receiver role and kind of one of the better highlight playmakers in the entire West Division into more of a defensive-minded role over the past half of the season. They install Lucas Ambrose, and he becomes, I was talking with somebody else, like an MVP level candidate right now. I mean, you talk about impact for a team and the kind of changes to both culture and the way that they approach the field defensively. I mean, who else but Lucas Ambrose has a kind of V in MVP as far as value. Like this Seattle team has just gone a complete makeover in the course of a year. And I think it's remarkable to kind of witness, like there's no real impetus for it other than they really wanted it. Like there's talent throughout this league. I think there's even a handful of teams that can claim they have better talent than Seattle. But you could just see over the last month especially that this team wanted it more than any of their other West Division adversaries. I mean, there's just like photographic proof. Even after they won their first round game against Oakland, they're like crying in relief of the accomplishments that they've had. And like you were saying about what Indy experienced in 2019, when you realize that level of confidence, when you realize that you're capable of these things, it just enables everything.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, confidence, when ability and confidence meet each other, magical things happen. I mean, and I think we see that with the Seattle team, not only just the ability, the confidence, but like, I don't think you can show me a team in the league that more visibly shows that they are just all rooting for each other more than Seattle. Like,
oh man, the celebrations,
it's awesome.
the just, it's kinetic energy around them.
Yeah,
and,
they're just.
And I feel like,
yeah,
I feel like your comment about how confidence breeds kind of winning is a perfect segue into what Minnesota did in their Central Division bout against Madison, where they just absolutely took care of business at home. They close out the fourth quarter on a 7-2 run and defeat Madison 23-14. The biggest blowout in several seasons in this round of the playoffs. Evan Lepler talked about it. It's the largest margin of victory since the 2019 playoffs at the divisional championship round. And so Minnesota sort of culminating in what we've been expecting of them, I feel like, throughout the season, of just this balanced attack that's able to break out at you on defense, and then this offense that can punch downfield and really make things I feel like, pressured for your defense to contain.
Yeah, I mean, and of all the games this weekend, it looked like it was kind of windy in Salt Lake, based on the way that disc was bounced up a couple times. This was definitely the most weather-affected game of the weekend. It looked to be incredibly windy. Not a clean game from either team by any stretch of the imagination. In fact, almost as many turnovers in this one game as the Boston, D.C. and Atlanta, Carolina games combined. But like Minnesota, as they have so many times in the past in that really windy environment that almost acts as like an eighth defender, just takes such better advantage of it than their opponents do. And this is a game that, like, there were even a couple of like questionable missed calls that could have resulted in like more scores for Minnesota. We saw the end of the second quarter, Brian Vanuka just makes
an all-time play, man.
a grab off of a ricochet and does get the hand inbounds with the disc in hand beforehand. I don't fault the ref for missing it. It was kind of bang, bang. And it's like one of those things, if you're not exactly in the right position, like with the exact right eye line on it, like I can totally see how they missed that. Then there was the play, I believe, at the end of the third quarter where Jordan Taylor, it looked like pretty obviously maybe should have been a strip call, I thought. Ended up just being a foul call, and with a throw in a similar throw, like a bladey throw to the corner, Sterling Kanaki is able to make a fantastic D on it to keep that from being a score. And it just kind of felt like, even, you see so many times where things like that go wrong for a team and it can kind of mentally break you, but Minnesota had done such a good job of putting a stranglehold on this game throughout the whole rest of what was going on that like those two plays didn't even factor in by the time we got to the end.
Yeah. I mean, Minnesota just did such a good job of taking care of the ball on both sides of the disc. They get 12 break scores. They also convert 11 offensive possessions for scores. And it just felt like, again, it was what the wind chill have been building towards this entire season, which is this balance between veteran know-how and sort of youthful playmaking, where you have Dylan DeClerc running out on fast breaks, converting break opportunities for the defense. And then you also have, on the flip side, Will Brandt soaring out a couple of gorgeous passes, Josh Klain looking fantastic in the deep game. They have the ability to go to Bevon, Quinn Snyder, Gordon Larson, who might be a candidate for most improved this year. Minnesota just has these pieces that I don't feel like any other Central Division opponent has. And on the flip side, Madison just kind of had the Cinderella moment run out of it. They win 4 straight games at home. They feed off of that Breeze Stevens environment. They're able to fast break on opponents on defense. And in this game, they get just 4 break scores. And on offense, they're 10 of 30 on O-line possessions. And I know they were without Pat Schreiwise, who's the real kind of stabilizing piece of that offense for the Radicals. But this felt like, again, kind of turning into a pumpkin a bit, where we had been riding high. There had been all this momentum. They had been a high energy team kind of punching above their caliber a bit throughout the 2024 season. And yet they run into this Minnesota team who knows how to match up against them well. And they just didn't really have answers. They had a clear disadvantage as far as throwing talent. I felt like that was so evident given the kind of elements at play, like you were saying. It felt like there was a pretty big yellow light on Kai Marcus, I want to say, versus on the flip side for Minnesota, Josh Klain and a bunch of the other Minnesota throwers kind of had much more capacity to rip in deep space. And that allowed Minnesota to sort of facilitate a little bit more up-tempo action, whereas Madison just felt like they were restricted to all these backfield passes that just led to the sort of mistakes that they've been plagued by the past couple of seasons. It was sort of a return to the wrong kind of form for the Radicals offense.
Yeah. They kind of fell into the trap that Minnesota wants you to fall into too, which is like, hey, we'll give you free open reset. and you take it, and before you know it, you've taken it 5 times in a row, and now you're 25 yards further back than you were before because you're like, oh, it's open, I'll just take it. Because the thing you really have to do against Minnesota's defense to like kind of break it open is be aggressive from the handler space and attack forward. Because of the style they play, they just leave that reset handler open. And if you attack forward, it can kind of just like step through and like throw it even just like a few yards. Now you have a guy who's like unmarked, and it creates a lot of issues. We actually had a lot of success offensively in our playoff game against them last year doing this, where our airs were not Minnesota's defense doing a lot. We had a lot of like, we threw into a snake in the grass. We threw a couple discs straight into the ground, but like when we attacked from the backfield, it was like really successful. But you're right, like the throwing talent was just so disparate in this game. I also think like a couple of things happened here that like really pushed Minnesota to just have such a dominant performance. One of them is the loss of Pat Shriver. Unquestionably, like Madison lacks a lot of throwing talent in their current state. They got a lot of young guys who are contributing a lot that aren't quite there as throwers yet. Taking away the most stable thrower on your roster, 100%. Like we saw even in the Madison-Chicago game where it wasn't super windy, there wasn't really the elements outside of the humidity, how they struggled when Triwise went out of the game. Like they just don't have a replacement for him that can do the same things he can, and they just need him so badly as a stabilizing presence. And the other thing is Minnesota finally had their top 20. Like they haven't been playing as well defensively in the back half of the season. I know we both had questions about like what can this team really accomplish because they just haven't looked up to the level that they did last year. And I think like it's going to be one of those things where I think people are going to look at it and be like, oh, they just destroyed Madison. Madison's not that good. And like Minnesota's not that good because like they just took advantage of a weak team or whatever. But like this is a Madison team that we saw kind of take it to Colorado. I know it ended up being close at the end, but like they kind of took it to them for most of that game before, you know, Kai Marcus had kept throwing the disc away deep in the second half to give Colorado a chance. And I think this does tell me a lot about Minnesota. Like, hey, if we finally have our top 20 guys, like all these guys who have been out with injuries or other commitments are now available. And when we're all here, we're still that team. Like we're still a team that can hang with anyone.
Yeah, I mean, they have, to kind of the point of DC and also Seattle, a variety of different players that can get blocks for them. You know, you talk about Cameron Lacey, Brett Bergmeyer, Dylan DeClerc, Anthony Jarrell is playing incredibly of late. Noah Hansen has come up big in a variety of opportunities. They're playing Bevon both ways, and he's always able to create turnovers for this wind chill team. You know, Minnesota, for some of their lackings over the past month defensively as far as pressure goes, to your point, seems to be able, once they're at full strength, able to sort of reform into their Voltron status of being a true elite defensive lineup in this league.
Yeah, and it's like I feel bad because I don't have we don't have the specifics in this game that we have in the other ones, because it's like, what specifics do you really pull out in a game where you win by 9? Like there's not a play we're going to go to. There's not like a matchup we're going to look at. Like this was complete and utter domination, and you know, there's not a lot to break down in a situation like that. I do think if there is a team that maybe is like the one, I could be wrong here. I feel like with them wanting to muck up offenses so much and kind of force them to make a lot of throws, make a lot of decisions, and they're as good at that as any team. And they're going up against an offense next week. And I know we'll do a preview pod where we kind of break this down more. They're going to be going up against an offense that is totally fine making all the throws, like totally fine if it takes them, you know, 3 minutes to get to the end zone. It seems like a really interesting clash of styles, and I'm like really excited to see that chess match play out, because if there's one thing I know about Minnesota, they're, first off, the DC Breeze has just like stolen half of Minnesota's team, so they know those guys very well. And the other thing is that their coaching staff is going to find ways to disrupt what DC wants to do, because they've shown it throughout the course of the last few years. Like, they will find ways to disrupt other teams. So I'm like really excited about that chess match that's going to happen between the coaching staffs of the Breeze and coaching staffs of the Wind Chill, and how that's going to play out on the field. Because I think, like, you know, Lauren Boyle, 100% like coach of the year candidate, like maybe even already has kind of taken the award, like considering in her first year what they've been able to accomplish in DC. Ben Feldman and all the coaches in Minnesota always do a great job. Like, they've been, I think, one of the most well-coached teams in the league for, like, especially like post COVID, like in that era. I don't think you can really point to anyone else as being better, or at least not like head and shoulders better than what we've seen up in Minnesota. So that's going to be a really cool matchup for me. And like, this was one of those games where pretty early you kind of knew Minnesota was going to win. Like, it wasn't like the other ones. And I kind of already started doing the mental preparation for like what that matchup might look like at championship weekend, as I was also taking in the Breeze game, and it looked like they were going to win. So I don't know. I'm excited for that one. Minnesota last year, a lot of people didn't give them a chance against Salt Lake, and they went out there, and if it wasn't for one of the most miraculous, maybe the most miraculous play we've seen in our league's history, they would have been in the title game. So like, they definitely acquitted themselves of like any allegations that they didn't belong there. And I think they still have that chip on their shoulder this year too, because I think they, just in talking to some of them and just the general vibe, it kind of seems like they kind of feel like they're that under the radar team again, that people aren't really giving them a chance and don't really think that they can do it. And they're going up against the favorites and all these things. And we saw how that played out last year. And I honestly think it might play out similar this year. I think it'll be a competitive game, and they'll find a way to put their mark on the game one way or another.
So without getting too far ahead of ourselves, we do have the two semifinal games determined. The first matchup will be between the Minnesota Wind Chill and the DC Breeze, followed by Seattle versus Carolina Flyers. Again, 3 of the 4 remaining teams have never won a UFA championship. Only Carolina has claimed a league title so far, so there will be a lot of intrigue heading into 2024 UFA Championship Weekend. That will do it for this recap episode of the Divisional Championship round of the UFA playoffs, but we will be back to preview both the 2 remaining semifinal games as well as the 2024 upcoming UFA Championship at Championship Weekend on August 23rd and 24th. And of note, for all 3 of those games, the 2 semifinals will be broadcast on watchufa.tv for a subscription price, but the 2024 UFA Championship game will be available live and free on the league's YouTube channel. You're going to want to tune in for that. That will be the pinnacle of the entire season, but that will do it for Cam and I right now. We will sign off and join you soon to preview the 3 remaining games in the 2024 UFA calendar. Bye.
Oh, he's getting the crowd going.
Are you kidding me? You are kidding me! Holy smokes!
Was there any doubt? Was there any doubt?
This is going to be the game. Joel Clutton battling for position. He tips it to the end zone where it's caught by Elijah Jaime.